UIi brings 20 years of experience working with native plants in public gardens with previous positions at Brooklyn Botanic Garden, Wave Hill Garden, and the US National Arboretum. UIi is the author of the Native Plant Primer, and he's here to talk about it. So I'm going to turn my camera off, and we'll talk to you later.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Kim, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak to everybody this evening. A hearty welcome to all of you that are tuning in. I'd also like to offer a congratulations to the Native Plant Society in New Jersey on your 40th anniversary. That's a wonderful milestone to have achieved. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about native plants, talk about the book that I wrote, you know, if you need more convincing, hopefully you'll feel so at the end of the talk that native plants are great. But I wanted to start with a little bit about me, and I wanted to start by giving credit to the women in my life who gave me my green thumb, and specifically my maternal grandmother on the left, my mother on the right, and my wife, who I met 18 years ago almost at Brooklyn Botanic Garden. I have a lot of fond memories growing up in my grandmother's garden in Germany. She and I used to go on nightly slug hunts when I was a kid. They lived in northern Germany, and the garden abutted a series of cow pastures, and nearly every evening hordes of slugs would emerge from the cow pastures to try to devour her garden. And this was a fun activity that she pressed me into with a flashlight and a pail and trowel. But I've always been, you know, kind of a curious kid. And when we moved to the US, we settled in Wilmington, Delaware. And I spent a lot of time at Longwood Gardens. And of course, as a kid, you don't realize what an amazing garden Longwoods is and has been. For me, the highlight was always, you know, running down to the koi pond and for a nickel, getting some fish food out of the dispenser. But I'd like to think that those early experiences to gardens, to plants, to, you know, design and color really sparked a lifelong interest. And I was always that kid that wanted to know what plants were in the woods. And if I turn over this rotten log, what am I going to find underneath? And we were fortunate enough to spend a year in Tucson, which also had a you know, fairly formative experience with me. I remember touching a prickly pear and telling my mom that it was fuzzy, only to come away with a handful of needles and spines. But that's how you learn. So, you know, I'd like to think that the same, you know, boyish enthusiasm that I sort of developed for this kind of work has carried through into my adult life. And whether it's, you know, allowing praying mantises or other animals and insects, salamanders to crawl all over me, or whether I'm extolling the virtues of sedges to some of my interns, I don't think I've lost that. And I think that's something that I feel very fortunate to have a passion for this work that has carried through and allowed me to achieve a lot in a career. I think that having done a lot of advocacy work for native plants, that I've really come around to the value of an inspirational and hopeful message, and particularly during the times that we live in now. And I really believe in the two sentences that are on your screens right now, that native plants have the power to heal landscapes, and that they can serve as a bridge between, you know, the wonders and awes of the natural world and us. I like to say that humans are a part of nature, not apart from it. And so as I've, you know, developed all these different talks over the years to talk about how great native plants are, you kind of realize that you don't win a lot of friends by garden shaming and by telling people that they're doing it wrong. And it's much more effective to present this as a positive action and something that is to be welcomed into your garden at whatever pace you feel you're comfortable welcoming those plants in. And listening to these kinds of talks, of course, gives you the inspiration and the information to hopefully make good choices in your garden, that will, benefit everything. So I think there's some big challenges that native plant enthusiasts face. One is convincing most people that ecological horticulture is the way forward. And what exactly is ecological horticulture? I would define it simply as weighing aesthetics and ecological value and function equally. So it means you can have beautiful gardens that also are put together intentionally to support the maximum amount of life, whether that is insect life, bird life, all the things that you want to see in your garden. These are all kind of tied into the relationships that they have with the plants that evolved here in place. And in embracing that is also a little bit of a pushback against what I think is a very Eurocentric garden aesthetic that many people still believe is what makes a pretty garden, is something that's neat and tidy. I think that we have an opportunity now to develop a distinctly American style of garden aesthetic that is not a direct copy of what folks are doing in England or in other places. Lawns certainly are another obvious target for this, as they tend to be very resource heavy. They are ecologically depauperate, but it doesn't mean that you need to completely get rid of them. As I was saying earlier to Kim, I have 2 young boys, and I understand the utility of a lawn and a space very, very acutely for them to run around in. But it doesn't mean that it needs to look like a putting green, and I don't have to drench it in pesticides and fertilizer, and I can interplant it with things to improve and boost the diversity of the lawn while still maintaining its utility and function. The last thing I think to understand about this process is that it takes time. We're working with organisms that exist on a completely different sort of temporal scale than what we're used to. And that, if I ask myself, how do you measure success in a garden? It has to be measured over seasons and years. Just in the same way that the knowledge that a lot of people seek is something that's built cumulatively over seasons and years and through careful observation. So native plants are having a moment right now, and I hope that it's something that continues. That's not just a trend, but I think that the time is now. If not now, then when? I would ask. And it doesn't mean you need to go completely 100% in, but even making a decision to, let's say, rip out a forsythia and put in a beautiful amelanchier is a decision that should be celebrated, and you should feel empowered by doing that, because you're doing your part to help local efforts, regional efforts, and national efforts to combat some of the challenges that our environment faces. So one of the things I think that has drawn interest in gardening has been folks being forced to stay at home. This is, you can quantify this in a number of different ways. I think this added and newly invigorated interest in gardening and native plants has a lot to do with how we're not sure what the future holds. There's a degree of anxiety around the effects of climate change and what they will bring, and how what we used to be able to count on as consistently snowy or cold winters or summers that are never really that hot has all been turned on its head. You have these other things where there's almost a barrage of news stories and information about losses and wildlife and major declines, and I think that there's all of that combined with I think a very human desire to make a positive change and do something to support the planet. And I think all of those things are driving this interest. I want to take for a moment a slight little tangent and talk about the loss of biodiversity for a minute. And I want to introduce something that's just something to get the wheels turning a little bit. And that is the idea of proportionality. So if we define biodiversity, it's the tally, the number of different kinds of things in a given space. So we're looking at a beautiful meadow scene from Maine here, and I can put on my botanist hat and I can say, we've got 137 species of native plants here, and I can invite my entomologist friends and ornithologist friends and say, okay, well, we can add, more numbers to this space, but if we consider other organisms. But what that tells you is that there's a lot of different things in here, but it doesn't tell you any of the relative proportions of those things. You could have a space that is completely dominated by garlic mustard with one native tree in it and still have a biodiversity of 2. And the idea of bioproportionality asks the question, and this is relatively new as a concept, but how much of one thing is really needed in order for it to be able to thrive and change and adapt in a very uncertain future? Is that 10,000 individuals? Is it 100,000 individuals? We don't really know. But what it does is it puts the onus on designed landscapes, and I think this is where this relates to gardeners, that if you have a space and you can plant 100 goldenrods, you should do that and really maximize the amount of goldenrods that you have in your garden, because your neighbor might plant 20, and the field down the road might have 100,000. So you collectively build up that number of individuals that can interact with one another. And also acknowledges that our gardens don't exist in a bubble. The other thing that I think that it challenges is the idea that we use biodiversity as a reason to justify the destruction of one space as long as there's something equivalent nearby. It's like cutting down a mature oak tree and saying, well, I'll plant a new one, and that is somehow a one-for-one swap. And so I think that if you consider proportionality, well, maybe you shouldn't cut down or develop the other meadow down the line, because added together with this one that you're looking at is what's required for, let's say, this beautiful liatris to be able to stay on the landscape, or the many grasses, or the other things that you might see in here. So it's a different way of looking at biodiversity and really asking how much of one thing do you really need. So as I said, the interest in native plants is really surging, and we can look at it through a couple different metrics, through public spaces. At Native Plant Trust, we get a lot of requests from state DOT departments for projects that involve seeding rights-of-ways and highway medians, and trying to transition away from mowing everything and seeing, well, where can we establish perhaps pollinator habitat, or reduce our labor costs and resource input. Pollinator pathways are another really great sort of grassroots efforts, led mostly by individuals, garden clubs, native plant societies that are seeking to connect existing natural spaces with other existing natural spaces by intentionally planting pollinator plants in townships, municipalities, public spaces, and private gardens. One of my staff members, very proud of him, was involved in the successful legislation of native plants in the city of Somerville in Massachusetts, that as of last year, any new public space plantings that are funded with public money need to contain 75% native plants, and ones that are appropriate for Massachusetts. And I'm not going to go through every list here, but you kind of get the sense that whether there are commercial interests like solar farms, or academic institutions, every botanic garden I know has some native plant display, all the way through to things like shopping centers. Everybody, there's slowly, trying to embrace the fact that, much of these spaces have been landscaped with non-native plants, and recognize the utility of those. In private spaces, we see increasingly more homeowners making choices to increase the amount of native plants in their spaces. The article here that's cited from last year was about a couple in Maryland that turned their front yard into a pollinator meadow, and that led to about a 3 or 4 year legal battle with the homeowners association in their neighborhood. And eventually, with the help of the Maryland State Congress, they won because they didn't say I agreed to certain landscape standards when we moved into this neighborhood. But the point is that you do need a little bit of courage to do this, and and that the pressures of fitting in with your neighbors are very real, particularly with folks that don't maybe quite understand why landscapes like this are important. It also goes back to what I was saying about the kind of gently pushing back against neat and tidy in the way that we've always done things. Added to that, which is also really encouraging, there's whole new generations of landscape architects and designers that are really putting ecology and native plants as central to their approach to design spaces. And of course, the surges in education interest is through the roof. If you would have asked me 10 years ago, would I see native plants on the front covers of national gardening magazines, I would have said no, no, no. These were, for the most part, maybe plant profiles that were way in the back next to the index. And here they are front and center in major horticultural magazines, which just means that, that the message is getting through. American Gardener, similarly here. How many of you knew that April was National Native Plant Month? This was a bipartisan Senate resolution that was adopted last year. It's likely to pass again this year, and allows for a lot of programming and awareness building around native plants. This is an initiative that has been spearheaded by the Garden Clubs of America, which is a really fantastic group. If anybody's a Garden Club member, please support their efforts. They are a force to be reckoned with. They are also approaching the governors of all of the states that they are active in and seeking to designate April as, New Jersey Native Plant Month, for example, into perpetuity, again, as a way to raise awareness around the importance of their use. And lastly, Forbes magazine. This is a place, the last place I would have thought to read about native plants and trends. And this really wonderful article here about a nursery owner in Tennessee that shifted to what she was growing from traditional non-native ornamentals to all native plants, and the positive response she got from her customers. She's now involved in restoration projects and so forth. So really wonderful positive things all around. And so that really speaks to the question that also native plant sales are growing, but that they're sometimes hard to get. Our own retail sales at Garden in the Woods and Nasami Farm increased 30% last year. And I'm happy to say that for the first time ever, we broke the $1 million in gross sales mark last year, which is something that nobody thought could be possible. But we've done it, and we're really excited about that. We have a great problem in that we're running out of places to put plants because there's such a demand for it. So I think one of the biggest challenges that folks face in using these plants is where to find them. The total hort industry is big business, $350 billion. And basically the three reasons why there isn't more native plants sold is because they're not available, because consumer preference drives people away, and just lack of knowledge of native plants. You add to that, aggressive and misleading marketing, adds to confusion. And I think we can all agree that the information on plant labels is next to useless. So there's a lot of things that we could do better in terms of serving the general gardening public and making these plants more available. Part of the trouble is that, native plant nurseries, like you can see here from Nasami, we grow everything from seed. So it's a little bit more labor intensive. Seed is one of the biggest bottlenecks in terms of being able to supply enough plants. And that many nurseries are small, and they just can't compete with the Monrovias and the large-scale nurseries, wholesale nurseries that are out there. Wholesale nurseries, similarly too, this was a great survey conducted by Mount Kiba Center a few years ago, surveying wholesale nurseries. And I mentioned wholesale nurseries because this is where the folks go who landscape shopping centers and corporate centers and new subdivisions and developments and so forth, tend to go to these places, and 3/4 of what they offer are non-native. Only 1/4 of what they offer, as defined as natives, are straight species. And nobody really seems to care about provenance whatsoever. And we'll come to those topics in a little bit. But just as an idea to show you how things can be really confusing, a lot of plant breeders put out series now. This is the Sugar Buzz series of Monardas with these names that to me seem like they really belong in a candy shop and not necessarily in a garden center. And what they are really varying shades of pink and purple and for Monardas. And because these are all patented plants, they're all grown from cuttings. So they're already inherently less genetically diverse than you might like. And so you can see the information that they provide for you is also pretty useless. It's native to North America. Well, that's great. You know, so are a lot of other things that aren't really appropriate to grow in New Jersey or in the Northeast. You say it's bee friendly. Maybe we could be a little bit more specific. Does it support generalists? Does it support specialists? What kind of butterflies does it attract? You know, we just need to do a little bit better with ecological information aside from you know, the cultural information here. And certainly let's not call animals critters, even though deer are a major problem. But, you know, they are also part of the ecosystem, whether we like it or not. So when we change things and we select for different characteristics in breeding cultivars, we may change the color and shape of a flower. We may change the time in which it emerges in flowers. We may be changing the quality and quantity of pollen and nectar, which are crucial resources for pollinators. And in the case of double flowers, and people love double flowered things, this is one of the sort of consumer preferences, they're pretty much useless for insects to interact with. With plants that have changed their foliage color to red or purple, has a negative effect on insect herbivores. So these are insects, maybe caterpillars or beetles, that rely on those leaves for food and for sustenance. And when we change them really drastically from green to other colors, these insects no longer recognize it as food, or it doesn't taste good to them anymore. The study showed it didn't matter if it was shorter, had enhanced fall color, disease resistance, leaf variegation. None of that seemed to matter when it came to insect herbivory, just changing that foliage color. And again, this is sort of a question about, you know, why do that? Because it's entirely for aesthetics. So Dr. White, this is a relatively well-known study that compared species and cultivars of those species for pollinator visitation and preference. In general, pollinators preferred the species, but there were a few cultivars that were outliers. And in the end, her suggestion was to say, we'll stick with open pollinated seed-grown things and avoid hybrids and cultivars that differ significantly from the species. I want to point out Monarda fistulosa Claire Grace at the bottom here. This was a plant that performed exceedingly well at the Mount Cuba trials for Monardas. But what many folks don't know is that it was originally sourced from a natural population in Mississippi, and it has questionable cold hardiness. She found in New Hampshire, or Vermont, sorry, where this was done, that it didn't survive successive winters. And she pointed out in her results that, you know, you'd be disappointed if you spent a lot of good money for a plant that was touted as a top performer and it couldn't even survive the winters. And it's that little piece of information about where it came from that was the key piece that was missing. Shrubs and cultivars have also been done. This was a paper put out from some researchers in Yukon, again, showing that in general, that it would depend on the group. And their conclusion, which I think is kind of a non-conclusion, is that shrub cultivars are not universally less or more attractive to pollinators and must be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. It's also worth noting, this was published in Horticultural Science magazine, that the authors of this were involved in the creation of the Yukon groundhog and low-scape mound plants. And so I feel like there might have been a little conflict of interest there. So this is what I put together when it comes to making those kind of suggestions, knowing that the majority of what people can get and have access to are cultivars of native, and you shouldn't feel ashamed. You shouldn't feel like you're doing it wrong in any way if that's what you have. If you are, you know, knowingly planting burning bush or you know, honeysuckles or phragmites, then, you know, definitely cause for shame. Shame on you. We should know better than that. This whole idea of aiming for 70% native in your garden is supported by lots of researchers, primarily entomologists and ornithologists, who have found that that is a good target threshold above which you're really going to be sustaining a lot of insect diversity and therefore bird diversity. But it's a goal, and it doesn't mean that if your garden is 40% native that you're somehow failing in this. And remember what I said at the beginning, that change comes slowly. So that remaining 30% is plenty of room for the non-native plants that play nice. Maybe you've got a nice peony that's been passed down through the generations, or there's any number of good garden plants. So we don't have to be completely a purist here. Better options, of course, as you can see, getting increasingly more narrow in geographic range. And of course, if you can get something that the provenance of and it's seed grown, because that'll have the best genetic diversity in it, that's the best option, I think, if it's available. But again, any decision along there, with the exception of the worst option, is something that you should feel empowered, and that you should feel like you're contributing to the greater good here. So why is provenance important? Provenance is the beginning of something's existence and of its origin. In the art world, we think of it as a record of ownership or some kind of documentation that signifies that the art object is authentic. And it's the documentation piece that's important here too. When you hear the word ecotype, it's referred to a plant of a known provenance. So we know where it came from, and that piece of information has been adequately documented, and it travels with the plant wherever it goes, whether it's seed, whether it's a liner that a wholesale nursery bought and then grew on and then passed on to a retail nursery. That's the chain of information that's broken for the most part. So if we think about why provenance is important, I'd like to look at the perspective of growing degree days. So these are a measure of the average days above freezing at any given place. So if you live in Orlando, well, you know that it's pretty tropical down there and it almost never freezes. Charleston has it a little better, 10 months above freezing. And you can go all the way up into Bangor, Maine, where it's only about 5.5 months above freezing. So any plants that you might find growing in Bangor successfully have to be able to grow, make flowers, set flower, get pollinated, and make seed and disperse the seed all within a much shorter window of time than something from Charleston or something even further west. And so this is why provenance is important, because of all of the other organisms that are tied to this particular plant, and those relationships rely on the timing of the emergence of the flowers or the availability of the seed to complete their life cycles. So provenance actually is really quite important for plants. So we really believe that local ecotypes, they are obviously adapted to the place where they evolved. They have maintained all of these existing relationships, and even the ones that we're not even aware of. If they're seed grown, there's a good deal of genetic diversity there that allows them to be adaptable to climate change. So as I said, many of the species that have co-evolved with all these other organisms enjoy this kind of beautiful choreography around the emergence of flowers and timing and these resources, and it builds up through the connections with the insects and the birds and the animals and so forth are all connected with the plant material. So this is just a picture of a variety of insects on the same day at Garden in the Woods. And most of these are specialists. They're not just generalist species. For this plant-insect interaction in a very simplified way, they both serve each other's end goals. For the plants, moving the pollen around is a way to get seed production, which means passing on adaptations and therefore a greater chance for survival into the future. Similarly, for insects, the resources that the plants provide are an opportunity to be reproductively successful and therefore a greater chance of survival for the species into the future. So from an insect perspective, a garden that is species rich is greater opportunities for plant pollinator interactions of all different kinds and shapes and sizes. And that builds those availabilities, those resources through the different levels for mammals, all the way up to our beautiful a red-tailed hawk here who was eating a squirrel. The one thing I wanted to say too about pollinator gardens, which I think are really fantastic, but we oftentimes in choosing plants for pollinator gardens are overly focused on the flowers. And if you want to see butterflies, for example, you need to also include host plants. If the host plants for those butterflies are not in the region around or in the vicinity of your pollinator garden, it's going to be really hard for you to draw the butterflies because they won't be able to exist in the first place. So consider also adding caterpillar host plants to boost the caterpillar appeal and butterfly appeal of your pollinator gardens. So some of these relationships are incredibly specific. What you see here is the spring beauty mining bee. This is the queen that can only survive on the specific pollen nectar from spring beauties. This is not a pollinate, it's not a preference on the part of this bee, it's a requirement. If there's not enough spring beauties around, you're not going to have this bee around. Pretty simple, straightforward. Milkweeds, of course, I think are a very well understood example of that specific relationship. And I'm showing here a couple of the maybe lesser known milkweeds that exist that can also make good garden plants. But monarchs are not the only organisms that eat them. You've got milkweed tussock moths, that same black and orange coloration, warning predators that they're not good to eat. Dogbane beetles, another group that like to eat the foliage of these of milkweeds. And of course, the monarch, which we all know is very charismatic of this relationship. Those webs of relationships extend beyond that. Another example here is colonie or turtle heads. The flowers are somewhat pushed together, and you can only the largest, most muscular bees can get in, and it's kind of delightful to watch them struggle to get in and buzz contentedly once they're inside. But this plant is also one of the hosts for the Baltimore checker spot. And if you've never heard of the Baltimore checker spot, it's a really lovely little butterfly. This is what he looks like. And without colonie, you will never have these in your garden. So again, it's about putting the right plants and being intentional about it. And those relationships extend beyond pretty pollinators to predators of pollinators. This is a crab spider that has evolved this wonderful, perfect camouflage to hang out in this particular Monarda species. And this goldenrod crab spider, for example, and you can see one of its victims in the back, has the ability in 3 to 5 days to change its body color from white to yellow so that it can hang out in yellow flowers as well and waylay pollinators. So these relationships are really, really quite complex, and they're really a wonderful and a joy to be able to see. And I think that if you're seeing these things in your garden, that's a good sign that these relationships are intact. So I spoke about food requirements for certain organisms, and you can also think of it as dietary restrictions. And this is a good analog because a lot of people understand having allergies. I have a niece and a nephew that are both celiac, and we have to be very careful about gluten whenever they come to visit. So I understand this very much. And so for specialist pollinators, and this makes up about 30% of the bee species, likely more if we include wasps and beetles and others, they have to have the specific plant that they like on the landscape or they're not around. Many of these tend to be small, they tend to be solitary nesting, and the plants that I'm about to show you, it's like a twofer. You will not only support the generalist pollinators, so these are your honeybees and bumblebees and carpenter bees, but you'll also support a lot of these smaller specialist bees, which help build out a healthy, robust ecosystem and pollination system. So lots of plants to choose from. You've got your golden alexanders and zizias here. The aster family is full of wonderful options here. And they also include things that I think many people traditionally consider weeds, like the fleabanes up at the front. These are annual species. Yes, they do seed around a lot, but they've got tremendous ecological value. So please consider leaving some of them. But as you can see, asters, coreopsis, rudbeckias, sunflowers, blazing stars, more asters, thistles, ironweeds, sneeze weeds. Boy, we have a lot of goldenrods, and they're fantastic plants, and they grow in a variety of different conditions. I would caution you that not every goldenrod is good for everybody, but Joe Pye weeds, bonesets, groundsels, campanulas here, the heath family, also full of beautiful rhododendrons, blueberries, huckleberries, maleberries, wintergreen, cranberries. You know, the list goes on. These are fantastic plants that might even provide you with a delicious little nibble from your garden. The mint family, we've got various Monardas that are fantastic. Our native loosestrifes are also really important for resin bees and oil bees because of what they collect. The plants make a particular waxy substance that they need to be reproductively successful. Rosaceae, mitellas and foam flowers, penstemons, beard tongues, and lots of violets. I think violets are fantastic plants. They are cheerful. They fill in tough places. If they're ever too much to grow, you can thin them out quite easily. And I think they make really wonderful companions in lawns. I have a lot of violets in my own lawn, and it's almost like a mini meadow that is in bloom in April and May here, and just alive with pollinators. And they're colorful, they're cheerful. You can put the flowers into salads if you want. I mean, there's all kinds of wonderful uses for violets. Nectar plants, again, more milkweeds, bush honeysuckles and buttonbush, things for insects that have longer tongues, so you're getting more tubular shaped flowers with lobelias and monkey flowers, wild flax or baptisias or agastaches, false dragonhead, iris, jewelweed even is fantastic. And of course, pollen plants like hypericums and willows. And willows are an incredibly important group because they're not only wind pollinated, but they're also insect pollinated. And they are amongst the first things to come into bloom early in the spring, and a really crucial resource for insects that are emerging now before a lot of other things come into bloom. If you think of it in this sense, 96% of our songbirds need insects to be successful to rear young. Where we live in the Northeast is a major stopover along flyaway from shorebirds, seabirds, waterfowl, land birds, songbirds, birds of prey. All sorts of things come through here every year, and they rely on the gardens and natural spaces not only to fuel their journey further north, but also places for them to stop and raise the next generation of birds. This study is fantastic. A pair of Carolina chickadees requires somewhere between 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars. No other groups of plants will support as many plants as insects as natives will. So again, things to aim for: seed grown, 70% native, embracing that species diversity, leaving it a little messy. Of course, avoid pesticides, leave the leaves. These are all kind of messages that hopefully you've heard before. Share your knowledge and pass it, and ask questions while when you buy plants. So with the backdrop of that, I thought, okay, here I have an opportunity to make a book that should be inspiring to gardeners to use more native plants. And how can I pour all of this experience into a good resource? And so I did so a couple different ways here. One is introducing the idea of ecoregions. And so this is an interesting concept because many plants don't care about our political boundaries. They don't identify as being from Monmouth County or Hudson County or Warren County or Sussex County or whatever. They are more distributed by natural features like soil, geology, hydrology, plant community, land cover use, and all of those things were kind of put together to make these larger ecoregions. So if you look at New Jersey here, you've got Atlantic coastal pine barrens that exist in the southern half of the state, and then Piedmont and northern highlands and a little bit of that ridge and valley, all in the northwest part of the state. And so the idea, if you know where your plants are from, then you'll be able to source them from within your ecoregion, because we feel like it means that that's how you define what's local enough for you and what's appropriate. Now, it's hard, again, if you don't know where plants are from, but the idea, I think, is good enough, at least in this as an introductory book, to put it out there and get people thinking about how plants are distributed on the landscape aside from political boundaries. I mentioned plant succession because I think this is also really important. This is kind of bringing a little bit of ecology into gardening, and that many natives, for example, and I use Canada goldenrod as an example. This is a plant that you find as one of the first things to move into abandoned agricultural fields. And it grows very vigorously through rhizomes, and it makes lots of seed. And it's a great plant with tons of ecological value. But if you put it into a small garden, it will overrun it, and it's just not the right garden. It's not the right goldenrod for that space. So knowing that if you have a large space, you can play with this plant. If you have a small space, there are other goldenrods that play nicer, that only make clumps, or they spread much more slowly. And you can still have the ecological value of a goldenrod and not constantly fighting against what it has evolved to do. Welcoming life into your garden is pretty easy. Lots of plants, plants covering the grounds, plants, shrubs, three-dimensional structure, add in a source of water, and you're good to go. As I've said before, we've got to a point where gardens can't just be pretty anymore, and that we need to also embrace this complex relationship. One of my favorites here is an attempt to show all of the ugly pollinators of Clematis virginiana, from flies to cicada killers to daddy longlegs, all involved in pollinating this plant so it can make those beautiful seeds you see in the bottom right. And what I find even greater is that goldfinches will collect those fluffy seed heads in the springtime and line their nests with it. And it's this wonderful circular relationship between all of these different organisms. We've talked about lawns. I won't linger here too long, but one of the other things that makes the book unique is that I only recommend species. And I think it's because of the importance of knowing the provenance, that they're seed grown, that we embrace genetic diversity. In other words, it's important to know how your plants were grown, and because it maintains all of those wonderful connections with insects that end up being bird food and so forth. I put lots of lists into the book because I love lists. They're really wonderful to, quick reference, including a truncated list of host plants for caterpillars and moths. Each of the 235 profiles has a little icon that can tell you whether the plant is used by birds, whether it supports pollinators, both generalists and specialists, if it's a food source for butterflies, if it's a larval host. And my favorite is the little frog, because mammals, reptiles, and amphibians also use these plants, and we should be thinking about their use as well. So an example here are the two different aronias, each having all of the different icons listed. And I really tried in writing the descriptions of all the plants to keep that narrative of ecological value consistent and in the forefront throughout all of the different sections. Vines, certainly. Wildflowers is probably the largest section here again, and encouraging people to go out into nature to see these plants is another really wonderful way to get information about who they grow with and what kind of conditions that they like. I also include a section about annuals, which has been a surprise for many people, that we actually have true native annuals. So things like rudbeckia or partridge pea, blue curls, or even jewelweed is a really wonderful native annual. And if there's ever too much of them, you just thin them out. But using them is, they're meant to move around. They're not meant to be a long-term members of any garden design. But they flower very freely, they have lots of ecological value, and you may be very pleased with where they show up in subsequent years. So, of course, all of this is really a belief in the future. Just all the quotes about show me a seed and I will show you a belief in the future. And I wanted to end with a couple of quotes from the book, which I think kind of sum up how I feel about it. That native plants, we're not trying to recreate conditions from the past. I think that doesn't make any sense. But it's, I think, a very forward-thinking act and a compassionate act that is meant to help whatever remains in terms of flora and fauna survive in a very fast-changing world. If you say that only using species is limited, I would ask the question, who are you gardening for? I don't think it holds up. And it takes a degree of courage to accept that humans are likely the cause of a lot of the challenges, environmental challenges that we have faced, and it in some ways questions what we find most valuable. And if you look through that lens of value, you can see that using natives is actually an act of liberation. It's not a shackle, it's not limiting by any means. And it shows that you place value in the ability of future generations to take advantage of the same benefits and privileges of biodiversity that we and our ancestors have enjoyed. So with that, I will say thank you very much for listening, and I am very happy to answer questions. Your choices do matter. Thank you.
Oh, hey, that was really extraordinary. That was really great. I have a question before we have a lot of questions in the Q&A, but
sure.
The photography for the book, is that you? I mean, I follow you on Instagram. Everybody, please follow UIi on Instagram. Amazing, breathtaking.
Thank you. Yes, they're, with the exception, I think, of 5 images, all the photography is mine. So thank you very much.
So good. You're so welcome. Well, thank you for that presentation, and let's get to it. So I'm just gonna start to read out some of these questions, and I guess we'll see how far we can get. We won't get to them all, but we'll do our best. So let's see. Although I have been, this is a native plant expert for years, the voles are ruining my enthusiasm along with my gardens. What can I do?
So voles, I think, are, I'm trying to remember, and I get tripped up between moles and voles, and which ones eat plant roots and which ones eat insects. And we've had if it's the insect eating kind, it's likely they're going after beetle grubs and things. And so I would recommend using a natural product called milky spore. And what this does is it builds up a population of a particular bacteria in the soil that prevents the beetles from molting and becoming adults. And it's more of a, rather than trying to poison the animal itself, go after its food source. And that tends to work out really well. If it's the root eating kind, again, it's tough to say. I think that a lot of the natural predators of these things are missing from suburban landscapes, whether there are snakes or foxes or other things, or owls. And it's a bigger question of how to reintroduce those more naturally. So voles, veggie, moles, meat. Cute way I look at it. Thank you, Consuelo. Yeah, it's tough. It's tough. And I feel the same way with people that have a lot of deer pressure, because it's very, very frustrating to put a lot of work into a garden just to watch it end up in a deer's stomach. We have a deer fence around Garden of the Woods, and it's the only way that we can grow orchids and lilies and trilliums and all sorts of other wonderful things, because they would otherwise be lost. Okay. So it's a tough question.
Yeah. So this next one is from Patricia. I'm a little envious here. She has a goldenrod field. She says, do you consider goldenrod allelopathic? My goldenrod field has looked the same for 36 years. There are spaced out gray dogwood clumps, and I have planted some trees which are doing okay.
Some can be. I think that my question would be, what are you doing to manage it in any way? And are you mowing it once a year? I think perhaps if you have the ability to use fire, that might also change some of the makeup. I'm not sure if goldenrods are, and if Canada goldenrod is allelopathic. It may also just be such a dense stand of it that other plants struggle to compete. I think with maybe some different management practices, you might be able to introduce a little bit more diversity into it. Again, I haven't seen the space, so best answer I can give.
Okay, moving on. Forsythia versus Amelanchier. So here we go. Forsythia, any advice for quick growing dense native shrubs that will survive deer and protect the birds? I think we know what you're going to say, but you go ahead.
Well, I mean, yeah, the deer trouble is, I could give lots of recommendations for quick growing and spreading and suckering shrubs, and there's a whole list in the book that's deer resistant. I don't think there's anything that's entirely deer proof, and also spreading and suckering shrubs that will fill in quickly. Whether there are ones that overlap there, I mean, again, it depends on if you've got sun or shade, wet, dry. I would really suggest taking a look at those pages in the book for some inspiration.
Okay. And Sheila wants to know, how do you counter the argument that native plants that attract bees should not be planted in public spaces because the fear of people being stung?
Well, I mean, I think that there's a lot of insect phobia that people have. That regardless if it's a bee, for me that argument kind of is the same. That like, well, what if a limb falls off a tree in a park? Should we not be planting trees for shade because there's a chance that something might fall down? And it happens. It certainly happens. I think if you look at if you weigh the ecological benefits that those plants provide with the I think very low percentages of instances where people actually do get stung, I think that the value is more important than the possibility of getting stung. We live in the Northeast too. Look, ticks is another thing that comes up a lot. I've done a lot of field work over the years, and I've had numerous tick-borne illnesses, so I'm very much aware of that, but it doesn't prevent me from going back out in the woods. It just makes me more vigilant about checking myself afterwards, and just, being aware of where I am and at what times of year.
Yeah, that's good to know. I had some tick bites myself last year.
So good quick thing for tick bites. If you ever have one and you take it off, don't throw it away. Scotch tape it to an index card and write down the date and where on your body you plucked it from. And if you grow ill, let's say within a week to 10 days afterwards, you can always have the tick sent away to be tested for whether it's Lyme disease or any of the other potentials that they can vector. If you toss it away, you'll have no idea other than you can do a Lyme test or something, but there are other diseases that they vector that can be just as nasty. And so, Scotch tape, it's not going to go anywhere. Put it on an index card and document it, and then you've got it. And if you're not sick after 2 weeks, then you can toss the card. And if you are, you still have the organism.
Okay, this next question is, I think, it's what we're all talking about when we're always, every chapter. Why are native plants so hard to get? Why are the wholesalers and the retailers and the nurseries not selling the native species? Why are they selling cultivars or even invasive plants?
Well, I think there's been a lot of pushback to change the way they've done things. I could sum it up in this way, in that growing plants from seeds, or growing plants in a environmentally, ecologically way forward, is not economically viable for many nurseries to do. They have come to rely on growing plants from cuttings, or getting liners, so smaller plants from somewhere else, much cheaper, that they can then pot on and grow on. And this wasn't always the case. Nursery owners 50 years ago would know the plant from seed all the way to the gallon plant that you would buy, but that's not the case anymore. Most of them, and particularly in the larger scale nurseries, plants, any new plant has to survive essentially high light, high water, and high fertilizer regimes so that they can pump them out as fast as possible. And so some species, and particularly some native plants and a lot of the non-natives, are very easy to grow that way. And then some of the native plants, let's take trilliums, for example. If you want to grow a trillium from seed, it'll take you 5 years to get it to a blooming size from seed. And that's a big investment for a nursery owner to say, okay, I have to hold on to this thing and keep it alive for 5 years before it's big enough, before somebody wants to buy it. And it's also one of the reasons why trilliums are really expensive. Spring ephemerals are other ones that, spring beauties and trout lilies and Dutchman's breeches and all these things that make the woodlands in the Northeast so wonderful and charismatic at this time of year, are plants that don't want to grow in plastic pots. So there are propagation challenges, I think, that prevent more of it being made available. I think the other thing is also availability of seed. I can say here that we, Native Plant Trust, we are putting together a Northeast seed network that we're launching this year. And it's an effort to address the fact that no coordinated effort exists in the Northeast to increase the availability of genetically diverse and source identified seed. And this is meant to feed into restoration practices and to feed into retail and wholesale streams. Currently, if you do restoration, most folks are going between 500 to 700 miles away from their site to get the seed they want, because there's nowhere anywhere close to here. And so you're bringing all those plants in from other places that has lots of other concerns in it. So we're really excited to be launching this effort, and that in the coming years, hope to really address the bottleneck of seed availability that can then feed into the retail streams and hopefully make more of these plants that we talk about as being the best choices, make them available for all the people that want them.
And you touched upon this just a little bit. Well, you just mentioned it, but we're in, you're a New Yorker. You worked in New York for years. Pots. What are some plants that people that live in this dense, and I'm in the city too, what are some of your favorite native plants that can actually live in a pot and come back the next year?
You mean like container plants, or
container plants?
There's lots of options for container plants. A lot of the summer flowering things, again, depending on if you have good enough sun, which is always a challenge in city conditions. But black-eyed Susans, mountain mints, monardas are all really wonderful choices. I remember I used to go by this guy's house in Williamsburg, and he had a puntia, or prickly pear cactus, spilling out over his railing, and I was like, what a wonderful choice. It's dry, it's hot, perfect plant. There's examples of people that do really neat like green roof meadows. There's one, actually, if you haven't been to it, the Kingland Avenue wastewater treatment plant in Brooklyn is fantastic. It's a beautiful meadow on the top, and I think they do tours of it, so something to check out and get some inspiration for plants that will do well. But unfortunately, stuff like, spring ephemerals are just not suited for, urban environments, unfortunately. You have to go to places like, New York Botanic Garden or somewhere to see them. Or come visit us up in Massachusetts.
Yes, everybody, let's go. I'm going to book my trip to the Native Plant Trust in Massachusetts this summer for sure. Okay, do you have a time for maybe one or two
Sure.
more?
I'm happy to
Okay.
answer more questions.
Let's see. I'm a chair of a shade tree commission. I'd like to move away from cherry trees lining our downtown. What would you recommend?
Or so tough native plants that that they need to be flowering trees. Um,
Well, yeah.
I mean, it's a tough order. You know, the some of the amelanchiers are not really great for urban conditions. I think that things like oaks and hickories make for really great street trees. They support a lot. You know, so Doug Tallamy puts oaks as the #1 genus that supports the greatest diversity of moth and butterfly species as a host. So you can't go wrong with an oak tree. You know, some folks suggest red buds. You know, again, in my estimation, red buds are not particularly long-lived, maybe 20, 30 years before they kind of crap out. Whereas oaks can be, you know, upwards of 100 or more. And there's plenty that are tough for urban conditions. Post oak is one that's great. Pin oaks get used a lot. Red oaks, you know, these are all really wonderful options. Hickory, certainly. I would stay away from things like dogwoods because of anthracnose in cities, and dogwoods tend to be very shallow rooted, which is tough to exist in a street tree pit when you have shallow roots and all the things that all of the activities that take place on top of street tree pits makes it a tough environment for trees.
The tree issue is definitely ongoing.
Yeah.
I think in just about every municipality.
Yeah.
Okay, so the last question there, I see multiple requests for this. Everybody wants to know, what is the plant behind you?
All
What
right,
are we looking at?
So that is the seed head of a dwarf dandelion. So this is a little annual called Krigia, and the seed is the brown part, and there are these little bracts that persist along with the little bristles that help it to kind of disperse. This whole thing may be a 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch across. So it's a pretty tiny little plant. It's something that you
Wow.
find and I saw this in one of the chat questions, and I'll address it because it's pertinent. And it comes up every time when I put in that list about things to do, and I put in poor soils are a gift, and it's like a bait that everybody takes, and they want to know why a poor soil is a gift. Can you please explain? So not all plants want to grow in the same soils that your vegetable plants grow in. There are many wonderful, unique, drought-tolerant native plants like our little Krigia here that are perfectly adapted to grow in really crappy, sandy, gravelly soils that have very low nutrient and organic matter levels. And the idea that you would want to amend the soil or change it to make it more neutral or add more compost to it doesn't always have to happen. And you actually set yourself up for a lot of extra work and extra costs attempting to change something that you know, the site didn't want it to be. So if you have a space like that where you've got naturally occurring poor soils, you actually have a nature's gift to make a garden that is entirely unique with really cool plants that doesn't look like anybody else's, that supports a lot of wonderful wildlife, including little things like the Krigia and things like the opuntias and, you know, butterfly milkweed and spotted horseman, and all these wonderful plants that really want to grow in like the crappiest soil possible. So rather than changing what you have, the idea is to pick plants that are suited to your conditions, and it's a much more sustainable and efficient way to approach, you know, garden choices than trucking in yards and yards of compost, and, you know, you're bringing weed seeds with it and all the other sort of things that come with trying to change that. So,
Okay. Where can people get your book? I know it's on Amazon. It's easily bought on Amazon, but are there any other bookstores that, you support that you would prefer to give a shout out to tonight?
So I would like to take a shout out for our own. If you go to nativeplanttrust.org, there is a garden shop link where you can buy it from us. You'll get an autographed copy. And I would like to suggest, or maybe put out a statement, that Jeff Bezos has enough money. Let's give it to us instead of to Amazon. I know he's very convenient, but we really could use the support more than he needs it. And so check him out. I'm not sure where it's distributed. There's been a lot of smaller independent bookstores and so forth that have carried it. Excuse me. So consider checking them out first before you reach for the online version. Or come check us out, like I said, at nativeplanttrust.org. Thank you, Mike, for putting the link there in the chat.
Thank you.
And what I'm also going to do here as we're winding up is I'm going to put my email address in here as well. And that if folks have any questions or any kind of follow-up stuff, please feel free to reach out. I will do my best to answer them as promptly as I can. And so, there's good smaller businesses is really the point here is, let's shop small and local instead of going to Amazon.
And your one final question for you before we let you go. You're coming up with Rebecca McMacken. It sounds like an amazing combination. Is that open to the public?
I think you have to register for it. Again, if you go to our website and click on our events page, you'll see some links to it. I think we just expanded the virtual audience because it sold out really quickly. So there should still be plenty of room for it. It is going to take place on Friday, March 31st in the evening. I think it's at like either 6:30 or 7 p.m. or something like that. So it should be a good discussion with my old friend Rebecca about all things native and urban planning and where we would love to go in the future.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for this. So we could probably talk to you for another hour, but we won't. Go get back to those little children of yours. And thank you for being here tonight and supporting the Native Plant Society of New Jersey. And we have many chapters throughout the state, and this has just been terrific.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure speaking to everybody. I hope folks feel inspired, and spring is here. Let's get outside and get planting. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you so much. Good night, everybody.